Alright guys, well, welcome back to this video. So I wanted to make a follow-up video. I know it's been 2 years and all, but essentially I saw some kind of questions or concerns about what should I do if instead of a manual PTO switch, if I have an electric PTO. And how do I wire that? How do I, either bypass the safeties on that, or, essentially just how do you wire a riding mower that has an electric PTO versus one that has a just manual PTO. So I thought I would just kind of go over it, sort of what's the wiring on an electric PTO mower first, just so you can have a visual on sort of what the wires are doing, where they're going, sort of how they're kind of run. And then we'd kind of get into the technical stuff, how it's actually wired up and how you can wire it on your own. So just sort of kind of basic things you'll notice if you have an electric PTO. I've got this one all taken apart, but obviously you'll have a PTO switch. And so normally if you had a manual one, you'd have a lever in place of that would engage your mower deck blades, or it's called a power takeoff, but essentially a way to power something else. And if you look on the bottom of our engine here, we have our electric PTO here, and essentially all this is a gigantic electromagnet of sorts, or magnetic clutch, and all it does is just squeeze, and then it starts spinning your belt down here. And one quick thing to note, if you're operating one, of course, is some people like to pull on these, real slow, and hopefully it'll engage slowly. You don't need to do that. The electric PTO, because it has the clutch, it will automatically do that for you. So if you've ever read your owner's manual on a manual PTO clutch, it tells you to try and engage it a little bit slowly, give, the belt and the blades and the brakes, just everything time to kind of catch up. But that's just the differences between electric versus manual. So obviously some common things to look out for, or common things that are electrical, is you're going to have a battery, and there's only really two cables coming off of it. You'll have your body ground, which mine runs to the engine block in this case. Sometimes that'll run to the frame, but usually it's an engine block. You'll have a starter solenoid down here. Sometimes they have, let me get you in close here, they have two posts like this one. Sometimes they only have one post. And the reason this one has two posts is because one of the wires runs to a ground, and the ones that have three, or well, they only have one of these posts, these little posts on the front, is because it grounds through the frame or wherever it's mounted to. And obviously this isn't exactly the best thing to ground, so sometimes they'll give you that wire that you can put at a better ground, usually on the frame somewhere close by. It's probably just on the back side of the studs here. And then you'll have either a fuse panel, or you'll have just an inline fuse. Usually it's going to be somewhere along the line of your starter solenoid system, because you'll have, as you notice here, this little wire is feeding power to the battery, and there'll be an alternator or a stator underneath your cover here, underneath the flywheel. But that's just essential parts that you're going to look out for. And sometimes if you have like a riding mower, the battery will be under the hood. Sometimes it'll be all the way in the back. And typically for starter solenoids, if you have a battery in the front under the hood, usually the starter solenoid will be really close to the battery, right underneath it, right above it, somewhere in that neighborhood. But if it's a battery in the back, it might be under the seat, it could be tucked up in the frame. It'll be a little bit harder to find, but they all look just about the same as this one. So essentially, you've got your wire coming from the alternator, and you've got a wire on the other side that runs through this loom, and it runs all the way down here to your starter motor. It's just one thick wire. That's all it is. Doesn't go anywhere else. And that will give power to your starter motor in order to turn your engine. Now, might as well kind of get into the more complicated wiring parts of this mower. So here we have a hour meter. Sometimes there's an ammeter. Those things aren't too complicated, and we'll go over them a little more in depth on the wiring diagram. But essentially, all you need to know is for an ammeter, you have your flow of power charging your battery on this little wire down here. Not the big one, but the little one. And essentially, your ammeter will just have the power flowing through it. So a wire in coming from your alternator and a wire going out to the battery. Now for your hour meter, it's going to be more tied in with your key switch. It'll probably be off of one of the accessories. And essentially when you have your key turned to on position, your key switch will allow power to flow through your hour meter into a ground. And in this case, there is 4 wires. You'll have a ground. Usually the 2 wires are probably coming from the accessory switch down here, or 1 or 2 of them. But essentially all that's going on in the hour meter there is power getting flowed in from the key switch being in the on position, and then it just goes to the ground. Now this is our PTO switch, and I'll go ahead and take off our connector here so I can show you a little bit better. But you'll notice obviously all of these are not occupied. All right, two-handed job. All of these are not occupied, and even if you look in this connector here, it's not even using all of these pins, and that's because there's a bunch of different variations of these. But essentially all that's really going on here is one of these rows goes and allows, or essentially it tells the ignition system that you're sitting on your mower and that it's safe to continue running the engine, which could obviously be running your blades. And one of them will go to your parking brake switch. So essentially if you have your PTO switch engaged or on, and you don't have your parking brake engaged, it won't let you start the engine or anything like that. Essentially all it's doing is trying to prevent you from trying to start the engine with the blades engaged, because that could be bad, put a lot of strain on the engine. Things could go wrong essentially. So they just figured, let's just eliminate that and not have to worry about that. And so we have obviously got our little key switch here. Now this is where things can get a little bit more complicated, because on most key switches, need a third hand, you'll have AC as well as DC power sometimes. So it's very important to make sure you look at the wiring diagram for your mower. But essentially your common things here, you're going to have probably a ground wire, usually the black one here of course. You'll have a green wires, and typically the green wires on most mowers will go to a safety or like a grounding switch. Essentially they're related to some sort of safety feature is what they are. And red will usually mean power. So in this case we have power tied in from our accessories together, so that way they'll both be supplied power. But you'll have like one of these will go to the battery, so that way the battery will be able to supply this key switch with power, and as well as giving power from the alternator. Usually it comes through the key switch and goes to the battery, or from the key switch to the ammeter. It can be some sort of variation of that, but we'll go into a wiring diagram to show you how you can just eliminate all this extra wires and make it a lot more simple. But there'll usually be a battery, a S or for starter solenoid, so there'll be a wire that runs to your starter solenoid that tells it to turn on. But before it can go through to the starter solenoid, it typically runs through all of your safety features, like it could be the parking brake, the seat switch, the PTO switch. If you have a zero-turn mower, you might be able to notice there's a little plunger down there. It's got safeties to make sure that you're not driving forward and turning the engine on. But essentially, it will send power to energize the starter solenoid, so that way it can send power to the starter. And typically it runs through a series of safeties before it does that. And then there'll also be an M or an I. I've seen both for ignition coil or magneto, kind of one and the same thing. And that'll just be a wire that runs to essentially the end of your spark plug. Goes into a little magneto. It'll be a small little block with metal and kind of a silicone or rubber molding. And essentially all that will do is it will ground out your magneto, so that way the spark will not happen anymore. Essentially it will ground out your ignition coil, so that way you're not running the engine anymore. Essentially how you turn off the engine. And then there'll usually be like an L for lights and A1, A2, or some variation of that. But essentially you'll have two things to run, sort of accessories, whether that's like your hour meter, or if you have an electric PTO. There's kind of a bunch of different options, but essentially you'll have some other options for other things. And there'll usually be a ground wire, just to make sure that everything has plenty of good grounds. So essentially that's just kind of the overview of kind of what's going on here and how to kind of, just kind of visualize it. So now we're going to go look at our little wiring diagrams up here, so that way you guys can kind of get a you can visualize what's going on here. I'll grab a pen too. So this is probably what 90% of wiring diagrams are going to look like for a mower, or something similar to this. And they may have some variation, of course, between models, but you'll have your big ground here that was on the battery over there, and obviously your battery's right here, and there's that starter solenoid right there. And you'll notice these are your only like really thicker wires, 4, 5, 6 gauge, somewhere in there. And that's just to obviously ground, to have a good ground to make sure your battery, doesn't have any problems like that, is able to supply power, things like that. And then this will be a thicker wire, and then you'll have a thicker wire running to your starting motor. And these are really the only big wires that are going to be on your entire riding mower, just to kind of put it simply. And so from here you can see that, as we mentioned, this little wire that ran right alongside the big wire on our mower over there, this comes from our alternator, which is way over here. But you'll notice there's some important things that are kind of gonna be in here. So sometimes there's a diode, but you're gonna need to have a fuse in there at some point to protect this system from getting too much charge, a sudden surge in energy. Things could go wrong. It's smart to put a fuse here to protect your starter solenoid, to protect the rest of your electrical system, essentially, is what you really want to do. So in my previous video, we were showing people how to simplify your wiring diagram, essentially in total, so that way you could just get rid of all the safety switches, just make it simpler and have a lot less kind of issues going on. So we'll just kind of set this aside because I want to kind of get into the things that probably most people are interested in at this kind of minute. We'll actually kind of come over here to get a little better background. So essentially we've got our ground wire, our battery, our positive wire. I have my fuse just placed here in this diagram, but you can also have it placed here along where your ammeter, as well as kind of your battery power comes from your key switch or your alternator. Well, your alternator's going to be on this circuit here with your accessories, but this is your connection to the battery through your key switch, essentially. And this is your starter motor over here. There's really nothing fancy going on over here, just simply having your starter solenoid from post to post. Once it gets energized here, it'll connect the two and send power to your starter motor. Now you'll notice how I have this one kind of written here. You'll have a wire that is connected down to your key switch. And I just kind of wrote out all of the things that are typically on a key switch or pretty common on your key switch. But essentially, on a wire or a riding mower, you'll have your starter solenoid, your S, on your key switch. It'll run to your PTO switch or just like a safety switch, essentially. And more often than not, that will be your top 2 pins, or just simply your 2 pin on your PTO switch. And essentially all that really happens there is it'll connect, it'll just allow power to flow through it, so that way you can engage your starter solenoid. And then you'll have, typically you need some sort of ground wire, or have a 3-post one that grounds out through the base, because you're going to need some sort of ground in order to prevent this thing from blowing up, or you need to complete the circuit. Because if I were to draw it out, essentially inside of here there is a bunch of little wires wrapped around a post that will connect these two together. And when you apply power to that little coil, it will energize it, and then it will connect these 2 posts. And essentially you got to have somewhere for that power going into your starter solenoid to go. So it has to flow into the ground, because you've got power flowing between these posts, and you've got power going into a little coil on the inside here. And then your power is going to run your starter motor, and you don't have to worry about wires after that. But if you have an electric PTO switch, you may have to wire your electric PTO switch in. You shouldn't really have to. All you really need to, in order to simplify it, is go from S, from your starter solenoid, and run that straight up to that post on your starter solenoid. And you don't have to worry too much if you crisscross them or you mess them up, because it'll only work one way, and the other way obviously it's not going to work. So you don't have to worry about it too much. You just need to connect a wire from S all the way to, typically I think it's the left side, but whatever's not the ground. So it should be a white wire. Sometimes it's white and purple. There's so many different variations, but there'll probably be a black wire that's your ground, or there'll only be 1 post. So you can even get a 3-post version just to simplify it even more. But essentially that's it for the main battery and starter connection. That's all you need to do. And this fuse can be like a 10 amp fuse or so, because most alternators on riding mowers and whatnot, there's somewhere around 3 amps. So you should only need a 10 amp fuse just to be extra safe. But I've seen some people put 15s or 20s and not really have any problems, but the common thing is a 10 amp fuse. So just making sure that you have a fuse will do a whole lot for you already. And then obviously battery on your key switch, you can run that through an ammeter to make sure that it's charging, and then just run that all the way up to the post on your starter solenoid that's connected to your battery. And then you'll have M for magneto or ignition coil, and all you do is run that up to the top side of your engine block, because that's typically where your magneto is. It'll be next to the big flywheel, and it's usually under that housing. So real simple there. All this does is simply connect your ignition coil all the way from your magneto to ground. So all that does is ground that out. So you'll have accessory 1 or M1. There's so many variations, but essentially you're going to have a accessory wire that goes out and around and will power things like your hour meter, your fuel shutoff solenoid, things like that essentially. And then you'll have an accessory wire number 2. So this wire will be sending power out, and accessory number 2 will be receiving power or sending power, as well as when your engine is running, accessory wire number 1 will also be sending power, because that's where your 3 amps of DC power, direct current, comes to recharge your battery. Accessory number 2 is the power that will run your lights, your PTO switch, other accessories like that. So there'll be a connection that'll run your lights, and typically that will be 5 amps of AC power. So they're going to be 2 very different things going on here. And your diode here, that'll be just before your alternator or your stator or your generator. There's a difference between each of those words. I'm not really too sure, but essentially what you're looking for is a ring typically underneath the flywheel with a bunch of copper coils, and that will be generating power and sending it back to the battery. and you'll have AC power before this diode right here, and you should have DC power after that. Typically about 3 amps DC, and obviously 12 volts because this is a 12-volt system on basically all of them. And in order to connect to your hour meter off of your accessory wire, you just run power into your hour meter and you have a ground coming out. And fuel shutoff solenoid is the exact same. You have power going in and a ground coming out. So all you would need is a red wire going in and a black wire coming out. Simple as that. And there's usually a red wire. This will be a red wire that's got the diode built into it. And this will be an orange wire because it's a little bit different and it has AC power running on it, more likely than not. But you really shouldn't have to touch either of these circuits if you have to rewire your riding mower. So this should already be good. You shouldn't have to touch either of these circuits. The only things you will have to touch are like your starter solenoid, this route, as well as maybe your ignition coil. There might be some safeties built into that, but those are really the only two that you should have to mess with in order to simplify the wiring on your riding mower. So yeah, you've got your power here, your alternator, and then orange going back in, and that'll connect up to A1 and A2. And then last thing, you'll have your lights. There'll just be power running to your lights and a ground coming out, and that's basically it. And just to kind of help people for that electric PTO switch, essentially all this thing is really doing on your top side here with your 2 pins, you have a wire coming in and a wire coming out. And if you have your clutch or parking brake engaged, then you know that then it will allow, that safety that'll pass through. If you have your PTO switch engaged, then it will disconnect these two. So that way your power running to your starter solenoid will be essentially open loop, or essentially there's no power running through it. It can't run through because either your parking brake safety switch is not depressed or your clutch is not depressed, and you have your PTO switch engaged. So you'll have to disengage your PTO switch and engage your clutch or parking brake safety in order to run through that safety set. But if you want to simplify it, you can basically just get rid of those and run your starter solenoid wire straight to your starter solenoid. So that way there's no way that it will have an open in the circuit because you don't have safeties. This middle section is where the magic happens for your electric PTO. So like I said here, you have the off of accessory 1. You'll see how wires come off and split off and go to your fuel shutoff, your hour meter. So just in the same way that you have a wire coming off for each of these, there will have to be a wire that comes off and runs up to your PTO switch. Now, it can be different for different PTO switches, so you need to look at your wiring diagram for your mower, or just figure out essentially which one of these gets connected when you pull the PTO switch, because when it's not engaged, they'll be disconnected because there won't be power flowing through it. And then that will be power running to your electric PTO, and then the wire coming out of your electric PTO will be a ground wire, and that's it. And then on the bottom, you have a seat safety. Usually it's going to be your 3-pin one, or this only really applies when it's running. So essentially you have blades engaged, the engine's running, you're sitting on the mower. If you fall off of your mower, then your seat safety switch will be, it'll be an open circuit or it'll be a closed circuit. They can be different depending on them. So we'll go over there real quick and show you just after I finish kind of explaining this. But essentially all you need is this to not be sending an open loop. So you can have your, just take off your seat safety, or you can bridge the wires here. You can put in a little connector that'll prevent, it'll always think that the PTO switch is disengaged, because if you have your blades on and it thinks that you fall off, it will shut off the engine. So let's go over to the mower and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So on that seat safety switch, we have, in this case, a normally open switch. So normally there will be essentially a plate and it'll compress, and when you sit on it, and it'll bring these two connectors together. So the way you could bypass that, simply put, is you just put these two wires in here together. Now sometimes there'll be a 4-pin version of these seat safety switches, and that's a normally closed or versus normally open. So this one in its current resting state is a normally open, so you want to close the circuit in order to send power through it. And with a normally closed switch, it will, in its resting state with nothing on it or doing anything, it will not allow power to flow through it. And in a normally closed switch, my bad, I had that backwards. In a normally closed switch, it will have power running through it all the time, and essentially you're just doing the opposite where you're opening the switch. And that is a little bit more common on like Troy Built, MTD, yard products like that. And more commonly than not, it's usually just a little rocker arm switch down here that has 2 pins together. And when you sit on your seat, or if you fall off your seat, it'll just open those 2 pins up, because normally they're held closed and it allows the power to run through it. And that's when you're sitting on it, or when you're not sitting on it. And then when you sit on it, it'll open them up, essentially. Basically, the only concept you need to worry about with your seat safety switch, if you want to just quickly bypass it, is whether or not you have a normally closed one, in which case you just unplug it, and then it will always be open, which is what you want in order to have power flowing through it, essentially. It sounds a little weird to think about it that way, but if you take it off, then it's open if it's a normally closed switch. If you have a normal 2-pin like this that is a normally open switch, all you got to do is just bridge these 2 wires together. Or if you don't have the stuff for that, you can just cut these 2 wires and twist them together, cover them up with electrical tape, and that will work just as good. But in essence, that's basically all you need to know in order to wire or rewire your riding mower, whether it has an electric PTO or a manual PTO. So if there's any questions or comments or things that I could improve on, things I missed or whatever, just leave them down below, of course, like you already know what to do. So that way we can help other people out, and hopefully we can both grow from this together, and I can start making higher quality videos, and you guys can be able to figure out what you need to know. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.